This presentation will focus on the history of Canada. So thousands of years ago, the natives, the same ones that crossed the land bridge when we talked about the ones that came into the US, also crossed, and some of them stopped in Canada. And so the natives had lived there for thousands and thousands of years, and then new people came in, the white people, the Europeans. And when those new people came in, obviously tensions were going to arise. They're both battling for the same resources, battling for the same land, all that kind of thing. Okay, we know how it worked in the United States, but how did they solve it in Canada? Instead of killing or pushing them out of the way, pushing the natives out of the way, they solved it through compromise. Compromise was the main way. And essentially compromise is everyone helps out to decide on a plan that absolutely everyone can follow and agree with and everything. And generally, most of the interaction between the natives and the white people in Canada have been pretty peaceful. So the first thing we'll talk about is those native groups. And like I said, they came across from Asia, across the land bridge, and some of them went all the way down through South America, and some of them stopped in Canada. And so there were a number of established native groups by the 1500s when white people started to show up. And so they were all established, and there were two kind of big groups of them, the First Nations and then the Inuits, but in south of the Arctic, so below the Arctic Circle, where it's not cold all the time, where it's a little bit more livable, there were the First Nations. And the First Nations were natives that, as a tribe, used their resources to survive, just like the Native Americans in America. If you think of it, they're like the exact same tribes. Some of them are the exact same tribes because they didn't have this random border between Canada and America. It was just all land that they all used. And so the First Nations you think of as basically the same thing as the natives in America. And they had similar lifestyles. They all lived in a very similar manner, but kind of different cultures. They had different small things about them, just like the natives of the USA. One group may live off the forest, and one group may live off the ocean. It's small differences. Okay, and then in the Arctic, it was a group called the Inuits. Inuits are the people that lived there and the people that still live there today. And so we'll talk more about that as we move forward. And so here's three of the First Nation tribes. The Algonquin were kind of the biggest tribe in eastern Canada in the Quebec area, and they were extremely skilled hunters. And so what they did is in order to hunt a very large area, they had transportation that they could go a really far distance and still come back quickly enough that they'd make it before nighttime. And so they used dog sleds to move across the snowy plains, and then they also used canoes to be able to move across lakes, rivers, bays, things like that. Okay, and so their main way of survival was hunting. The Iroquois, however, living in southern Canada, they were kind of in the plains region, and so they had these huge villages that were farming villages. Okay, and so they grew mostly corn, and they would trade that corn or their excess corn with the Algonquin people for some of those forest products and some of those meats and things that the Algonquin were able to get that the Iroquois could not. The last type of native here is the Plains Indians, and the Plains Indians, just like the ones in the United States, hunted buffalo. They used every part of the buffalo, and they followed them season by season. They had these big teepees that they could bring with them, but you wouldn't want to set it up every single day. And so in the summer they'd go down south, or in the winter they'd go down south, and in the summer they'd come up north. The last of the First Nation people that we're going to talk about are the Yale and the Coochie. And the Yale and the Coochie were mostly on the Pacific coast of Canada, so right along the ocean on the west side. And they also used the forest to survive, but their main source of meat was through fishing. Okay, and if they were in a little further where they had more access to the rivers, then they would often fish salmon. You can see they have this picture is of a salmon trap that they've set up where all the salmon have to go through this area, and they can spear them and then cook them. Or if they were on the ocean, then they would go out and they would hunt whales, and they could eat the whale meat, but they could also use the fat, the blubber, as oil to heat things and create light and things like that. And now remember, the Inuits were not part of the First Nations. They're an entirely different type of native, okay? And they lived in that harsh climate of the Arctic where it was really, really cold and kind of hard to live, honestly. And they still do. They're still the people that live up there. There's not a lot of other people that have chosen to live up there. And so, in order to survive in a barren wasteland, it's almost like a desert because you just don't have that much access to animals, and you can't grow plants, and you can't do all of these different things, and so you need to constantly be moving around and following animals and hunting to survive. And so they were a consistent nomadic community. Nomadic meaning they're always moving, constantly in motion, following those animals. Okay, and really they're still the largest population of people that are in the Arctic today, so they're still around today. When the first Europeans came over, what they were looking for was something called the Northwest Passage. And what they thought they would want to find is a way to get to Asia where you could go straight through Canada somehow. Okay, and so they looked all over the place and they tried many, many different ways to do it, but they never did find that Northwest Passage because it doesn't exist. Okay, and so they wanted this all-water route straight through the continent from Europe to Asia, but there just wasn't because of all the mountains that run up and down Canada and America. And so why did they stay? If they didn't find what they were looking for, why did they stay around? Well, what they did find was an amazing plethora of resources, tons and tons of resources that they could use to make money off of. And so some of the big ones that they found in Canada were fish and furs, and they could use the fish to sell for meat as well as to eat themselves, but they could use the furs and make a whole lot of money off of that, because the furs that they were getting, things like beaver pelts and minks and stuff like that, they were worth a ton of money back in Europe for clothing. People were making hats out of them and coats and all kinds of stuff, and they were worth a lot of money. And so they would go around and trap and try and get these furs. And then they would set up these trading posts where some of them, instead of going out and hunting the furs themselves, would let the natives hunt the furs, and then they would trade kind of goods, like European goods, manufactured goods, like pots and pans and guns and weapons and metal things that the natives didn't have before. And so they had started this relationship where they were working very close together with the natives, and they were making a lot of money because the natives would come in and trade furs for the goods that they had, and then they could sell the furs back to Europe. The other thing that happened that was unintentional, not on purpose at all, was they ended up bringing their own European diseases with. And that European disease that they brought, the natives didn't have any built-in immunity to it because they hadn't been exposed to it. And so again, like we hear about when these Europeans came across, a large percentage of the Native Americans died off from the disease that was brought. The first land to be claimed in Canada by Europeans was the eastern part of Canada, and it was claimed for France. It was called New France at that time, and Jacques Cartier, this guy on top, he was the man who came in 1543, discovered it, and said, this is New France. And really, what was it mostly? It was mostly a bunch of fur traders living not near each other, no colonies set up, no cities, nothing like that. And so it actually took 65 years until a colony was created in New France. And that was when Samuel de Champlain, this bottom guy, came in 1608 and created a colony in Quebec, where Quebec City, Quebec is right now. And so over the next 100 years after that, it took time, but the French started to settle the St. Lawrence River in Quebec and kind of fill up that area with French colonies. So as the French were establishing themselves in the area, the British had also come over and taken and claimed a part of the land as well. And when the British came over, they claimed this entire purple area that's shown on this map down below. Now, New France is over here in this area. Okay, so France had claimed this, but that purple area was claimed by the British, and most of it was given to Hudson Bay Trading Company, because it was right around the Hudson Bay, and there was a new trading company set up called the Hudson Bay Trading Company, and the British king gave them the land in order to start to colonize it and start to get people there and try and get a foothold in this big money business of trading furs. And of course, as they're trying to get a foothold and the French are trying to continue to dominate that, the French and the British both are trying and working as hard as they can to dominate the fur trade. And so obviously, you're both trying to make the same money. Conflict started to arise. The French and the British, which historically don't like each other very much anyways, started to get angry at each other about what was happening in Canada. So as this conflict started to arise, the native tribes started to work really, really hard to gain the favor and become friends with the side that they thought was going to win. So some of the native tribes joined the French, and some of the native tribes joined the British. And so both of these sides had natives that were trying to help out as much as possible because they wanted to be on the winning side and continue that trade that they could do, because all they had to do was give away animal skins, which were worthless to them, for all these good products that they didn't have. And so as they were making their alliances, the 7 Years' War began. In 1756 it started, and it went for 7 years to 1763. And so what was happening is Britain and France were fighting each other in Europe, and then it leaked into North America. It leaked into the Americas, and it leaked into Canada and into the United States, and the French and Indian War happened. We call it that from the English side of history. We call it the French and Indian War because the English fought against the French and Indian tribes. It is not between the French and the Indians. It's between the English versus the French and Indians. And so there was fighting for a long time, and it ended up with the British winning the war in the end. And so Canada became completely British. It was completely belonged to the British. And so it became a colony of Britain, but it still had people that were French and people that were British. So there were two distinct cultures, and they had to decide, how can we make this work? And so they made it work the same way they make a lot of things work in Canada. They compromised. And so when the British came in and took over, they did not want a rebellion. They didn't want the French Canadians fighting back. And so they tried to show respect to the French Canadians. And so in 1775, they put together the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act allowed religious freedom and French laws in that area. Okay, so within their borders, it allowed them to have their own religion, because the French were Catholics and the British were Protestants, as well as have their own law system. And the other thing that it did at the same time is it made their borders bigger. It took more land. And so what happened there is it made the Americans very angry. Okay. And so eventually many things happened, but it ended up with the Americans being mad at the British for a lot of different reasons, including this, and they fought for their independence. The Americans did. And so the people that were loyal to the British ran to Canada when they had lost, and so the British ran into Upper Canada, and it became this area with British language and government, religion, and all that kind of stuff. And then the French kind of stayed in that Lower Canada, Quebec part, okay? And they were allowed to keep their French language, keep their customs, keep their religion, all of that kind of stuff. And so in this new colony, there was this kind of separation between the two areas. And so there were two very distinct cultures, which were both allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. And so that was the British heritage people in Upper Canada that spoke English. They had a government with a parliament and the king and all that kind of stuff. They dealt with the British government and the British type of law and all that kind of stuff like we have today. And their main religion was the Protestant religion. So these are all very British things, and that's kind of what they dealt with in Upper Canada. But in Lower Canada, they said that's okay if you keep your own stuff. So you can speak French. French can be your main language. Doesn't matter to us. We're okay with that. You can have a French government system where the French is a little bit different because their laws are based on previous laws that have come through and decisions that were made by judges. And then that's what kind of makes the new laws is case decisions by judges on previous laws. And so that was part of the French heritage as well, and then they were also allowed to maintain their religion as Roman Catholics. So because of the Quebec Act, when some land was taken away from America and given to Canada, Canada and America just couldn't agree on their borders. And so eventually that turned into a war, the War of 1812, which there were other reasons for it too, but if you look at it from the Canada side, this was the big reason. And so the United States invaded Canada in 1812. And the War of 1812 happened, and eventually it came to peace. They came to a treaty, and what happened is nobody really won this war. And so Canada was still a part of Britain. Canada didn't get any extra land. America didn't get any extra land. It was just kind of a war for no reason. And so the one thing that it did for Canada is it brought the Canadians together because they now had a common enemy that they were mad at, and that was the United States. And so it helped them out at least with that, because instead of fighting French versus British in Canada, they were they both could be mad at the United States. And so everything was going pretty well, and they were kind of united until some problems started to come up. And what happened is there was major food shortage, and so there were famine. People were starving to death, okay, and disease hit at the same time of big flu. And so when things start to go wrong, you always blame the government. That's just what people do. And so that's what they did, and people started to rebel and fight against the government and the people there to kind of oppose British rule. This was particularly a problem in Quebec, where the French people were living. They didn't like how the British were in charge of them. And so instead of clamping down on Canada and on the people that were rebelling against the British had learned something from, trying to clamp down and take really hard control against the United States. And they thought, instead of doing that, let's try something else. And so they did the 1840 Act of Union, which said Canada now becomes a province of Britain. And so a province is a territory that's still under control of Canada, or of Britain. Britain still has ultimate control, but now Canada starts to get to have input on what they want. Okay, and so what this is they gave them the first step to, independence, the first step towards being their own country. And so that calmed down all of the fights. And so it only took 27 more years, and the British North America Act came through, and they upgraded themselves from a province, which is, under control of them, to a Dominion of Canada. And so the Dominion of Canada was now, a British Dominion over here, and that is a territory that completely governs itself, but is still tied in some way to the colonizing country. So Britain still controlled all of their foreign affairs, still controlled how they dealt with other countries, but anything in Canada, any Canada stuff, Canada got to deal with. It wasn't Britain's decision on how to do that. And so another step towards becoming their own country in a peaceful and political way, as opposed to fighting like America did. And so over the next 100 years, Canada started to grow. So the economy really started to grow in the early 1900s, and it grew because of immigration, because of the immigrants coming in to work. From 1901 to 1911, it started out in 1901, the immigrant percentage was 12%, and the number went up to 22% in only 10 years. So it grew, the entire population ended up growing by 34%, and that immigration rate was the reason why it grew so much. And so the people that were coming in were British people that wanted to live and have a new opportunity, some Americans that didn't agree with some things that were happening in America, as well as Russian Jews who were coming over there because they were being persecuted in Russia because of their religion. And so Canada continued to prove to itself and to Britain that it was ready to become a world leader and become its own country. And so the way that they did that is Britain joined World War I in 1914. And so since Canada was still a part of Britain, they also joined the war too. And so a war is very expensive. We know that. We've talked about that before. And so it costs many, many people and lots of resources. And so in order to pay for all those people and resources that they had to spend, Canada had to collect their first income tax. And so they started to do responsible things that made them look even more like a country. And also in 1918, Canada created its own Air Force set of airplanes, fighters, separate from Britain. And so they were showing more and more that they were kind of ready to be an independent country. And in 1931, the British saw that and they gave them their independence because they had proven that they were ready. And so in 1931, that's when Canada became its very own country. It's still very closely linked to Britain, as you're going to see when we talk about their government in the next slideshow. So in the 1930s, that same Great Depression that had started in America but caused problems in the entire world caused some really major economic issues in Canada. And so the prices were going down and the unemployment was going up, and it was just really hard to a lot of people didn't have jobs, and so they didn't have any money to be able to buy food or shelter or clothing or anything. And so it was very, very hard times. And so people started to demand that the government does more to help out. And so new political parties in Canada were created around the ideals of Canada helping their citizens a little more. The thing that finally lifted the Canadians and really everybody out of the Great Depression was World War II. Okay. And so the other thing that happened because of World War II was it ended up helping make the economy less about agriculture, less about farming, and more about manufacturing, because they realized we need to have factories to be able to build all of the different things that we need. Even it turned from factories that were building tanks and airplanes into factories that were building refrigerators and dishwashers and other consumer items. And so really it brought them into the next century. It caught them up with some of the top countries in the entire world. And so new businesses and new technology was able to develop because of that need to develop manufacturing.